if you do an investigation of our own history, our own fiqh tradition, our own tafsir tradition, it's not as cut and dry, black and white as we're presenting it post-colonialism.
That kind of material, later on you find, Azhari scholars, and even before them, people like Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, Al-Alusi in his tafsir, who are very negative about Isra'iliyyat. And if they see, patriarchy as the source of all problems, then the tafsir tradition just reflects that patriarchy. That is to say, it's all men talking from male perspectives and sidelining women perspectives, because you don't find really in our history and tradition, you can barely, if at all, find a female mufassira.
So what are we doing now?
Well, what are you reading? Who's that? Handsome fella?
I saw myself in a book. Kole.
So what's this book called?
Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today, Media Genealogies and Interpretive Communities.
So of course I knew that. I'm just asking you rhetorically. This is by Professor Johanna Pink, who is the lead investigator on the Global Quran Project, which I was privileged to be part of for a little while. And I happen to know that she's written about you in here. And you had your first opportunity to meet her just recently at a conference.
I did.
So in general today, inshallah, we're talking about Western non-Muslim writings on the Quran, but it's actually a bit broader than that. Some of these people actually are Muslims. But it's also a little bit unfair to just lump it all together based on the religion of the author, because there are topics here that fit in with other things that we've talked about, and we could certainly have kept it in there. But I thought it might be helpful to look at it
as Western academic Islamic
as a group to see some of the trends and the patterns and the issues that are being raised there. So I don't have that many such works in print, to be honest, but these are the ones that I do have. Based on the last discussion about Quran translations, this is one by Bruce Lawrence, which is The Quran in English, a Biography. It's quite a nice treatment of the subject. I didn't steal it from a library. I bought it from an ex-library, so yeah.
Okay.
This is one called The Art of Reciting the Quran by Christina Nelson. I read this when I found it in Cairo in 2004, and I was so surprised at this treatment of the issue of Quran recitation. It was so thoughtful and insightful, and the author actually interviewed some of the great famous Qurra, like I'm sure I think Sheikh Al-Husri, Sheikh Nishawi, Abdul Basit,
really?
And others, and she examined the kind of overlaps but also distinction between Quran recitation and music. She herself is both an Arabist, a student of Arabic cultures and language, and of ethnomusicology, as it's called. So different musical approaches. That's Sheikh Mustafa Ismail on the front, I'm pretty sure. So I actually invited her to come to do some lectures in the UK in 2006. So we did at Edinburgh, Cambridge, and at SOAS in London. So lovely lady. God, a Man in the Quran by Izutsu. He's got a few important books looking at the semantics of the Quran, words and how they're connected, the concepts. Semantic fields is one of the key words in his semantics of the Quranic Weltanschauung.
Oh, I had some this morning.
So this actually is a very influential book and certainly useful. And I've seen over at Marcus Tafsir, they actually did like a kind of roundtable type thing on this book.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Here are a few books from Edinburgh University Press. My own book, inshallah, will be coming out from them. So I'm interested in their back catalogue of works on the Quran. We've got How to Read the Quran by Carl Ernst. It's a very popular book. It's been printed a lot of times. Quran Historical Critical Introduction by Nikolai Sinai, whom you've also met a couple of times now.
Correct, yeah.
And Islam and Literalism by Robert Gleave. It's not specifically in Quranic studies, but definitely has a lot to do with
Overlap.
Literal expressions and what that means in the context of Quran and Hadith and so on. These are by a couple of Muslim brothers actually, Ramon Harvey and Peter Coppins, both of them friends of mine. So The Quran and the Just Society was Ramon's first book based on his PhD. His supervisor was Professor Abdul Halim, just like myself. And he's done a lot of great work since then, continues to publish, and also is the editor of a series on Islamic scripture and theology at Edinburgh University Press. And this one on Seeing God in Sufi Quran Commentaries by Peter Coppins. He's very strong in tafsir studies. He's got a lot of interesting papers. One of his recent papers was about, I'm trying to remember the actual title of it, but it was about whether over time the appreciation for ambiguity and complexity wore off in works of tafsir. So he's looking at how the toleration and the respect for multiple opinions has actually remained more stable than people tend to think. In the modern period, it just completely collapsed. In that regard, this is an important book. It's not specifically Quranic Studies again, but this is an important book which I actually wanted to show you, especially. And I haven't read it yet. But to be honest, just the title.
The culture of ambiguity.
The title for me carries so much meaning.
History of Islam. Interesting.
Generally speaking, or broadly speaking, his argument, and this was written in German originally, and then it's just recently been released in English as well, is that, throughout Muslim history, there's been a lot more acceptance of the fact that things can sometimes be a little bit indeterminate, a little bit ambiguous. And that even applies to, a discussion. One of the discussions he does touch on was what we just said about qira'at and the fact that there are multiple ways of reading. And sometimes you can have even a discussion about, is this the better way? Is that the better way? So there's a search for the best answer to that question, but not necessarily to say there is only one answer and every answer must be wrong. Everything else must be deleted. Everything else must be ignored. You're able to say, well, this is the qira'ah that we read and we respect the other qira'at, and they exist together. There's no sense of panic from that. And that applies in various different fields where, an appreciation of ambiguity is actually something which is very healthy. So he's kind of making that argument, but he's also making a point that this appreciation, plummeted in the later periods, and that is part of the intellectual crisis that Muslims are suffering from today. So personally, I think there's a lot of value in his argument, even if, one could debate over specifics. So I think you know some of these books already. So you must have read Neil Robinson.
I have.
Discovering the Quran. That
contemporary approach to a veiled text, yes. It's one of the first Western books I read on the Quran.
And Professor Abdul Halim, you might have read this one. He's got various of his essays that are compiled in a few.
No, I haven't read that one.
Books like this. So Professor Abdul Halim, of course, has had a very important role in, as being a professor of Islamic studies and Quranic studies in SOAS, University of London, has made space for plenty of other people, myself included, to be part of the Western Academy and to be part of those discussions.
Yeah.
And, showing that we can respect each other, we can have different methodologies and points of view, and we can get along one way or another. This is a friend of mine from Al-Azhar University. He did his PhD at Birmingham on a Quranic critique of terrorism. Quite a nice book. This is one which I haven't read yet, but the topic seemed so worthwhile that I bought this one. The Quran and the Aesthetics of Pre-Modern Arabic Prose. So again, linking Quran within the broader study of literature and therefore, helping to understand how claims about the Quran and its beauty and its perfection, how they fit in. This is actually here the first Orientalist book on the Quran that I bought. So I don't remember when. it was, but this was the first one. I'm pretty sure it's from Princeton University Press. Yeah, The Quran's Self-Image by Daniel Madigan.
Does he mean by that the way the Quran describes itself?
Yeah, how it presents itself and almost how it sees itself. And so this has given rise to a number of other studies that followed from this. Self-referentiality of the Quran. There's at least one edited volume on that by Stefan Wilde. There is, we met a French scholar who's written one which the title is The Quran According to Itself. We've also met this author, a good friend of mine, Marijn van Putten. So this is his book, which has recently been released with Brill Press in the Netherlands. Quranic Arabic from its Hijazi origins to its classical reading traditions. So he takes a lot of interest in the history of the Arabic language. He's studying it from the perspective of a historical linguist and Arabist. And he is interested in looking at what you can understand about the language of the Quran from its manuscripts and from its consonantal text, and then from how people have vocalized and pronounced it according to the qira'at and the reading traditions. So from that he makes some novel claims as well about the language of the Quran. But importantly, this helps us to get past certain oversimplifications that we make about, oftentimes people think that classical Arabic equals Quranic Arabic. But of course, classical means that, post-Quranic, how things were classicized and became standardized and rules were set in place. Once you look at those rules, as you know, and you look back at the Quran, you're like, oh, it's not following those rules.
Right.
So then it can set you into disarray. And then you get people coming along saying, oh, the Quran is ungrammatical.
Grammatical errors, yeah.
So I have a video with Marijn actually where we talk about some things, and the last point in the video was specifically about this question: is there a grammatical error in the Quran? And his answer was, well, there's no such thing as a grammatical error. So no, it doesn't. Just because for him as a linguist, the idea and the category of grammatical error, they don't
look at grammar like that. They look at language as a natural flowing process.
Yeah.
Modern linguists will say that Scottish English is just as valid as any.
And why shouldn't it be?
That's so this is why you like Marijn.
So we've got lots here, but maybe a kind of subset which is worth highlighting is that there are lots of books published in talking about gender in the Quran, and I don't have that many of them, but I have a few that I've picked up over time. So we have had the opportunity to meet at least one of these authors.
Yeah, we did.
Serene Ibrahim, her recent book on women and gender in the Quran.
I haven't yet read it, but I plan to.
And this one by Hadi Mubarak, we saw a bit of her speech.
Yeah.
This book...
she was the one online?
Yeah, she was online.
I read a little bit of this book yesterday. It seems very interesting.
So what I think is...
she's trying to show due regard to the tafsir tradition, which is strange for a Western academic, but that's what she's trying to do. I didn't get to her conclusions yet, but...
So sometimes you do find with people who are writing in this kind of field that they have a certain disdain for the commentarial tradition.
Yeah.
And if they see, patriarchy as the source of all problems, then the tafsir tradition just reflects that patriarchy. That is to say, it's all men talking from male perspectives, right, and sidelining women perspectives, because you don't find really in our history and tradition, you can barely, if at all, find a female mufassira. If they were doing that, then it was interesting. So
they
didn't get published and so on.
They had a session on women in the Quran and at the convention, and all these Western academics are sitting there, all of them female, and some of them, almost all of them, 2/3 of them Muslim, at least, in the panel.
Almost all of them, yeah.
Yeah. And so a couple of them said, we have to let go of this narrative. It's unacademic. We just have to look at people in the Quran. Why are we looking at women in the Quran, or putting a gender lens on this text? It's actually creating a bigger problem than solving it. Like this was the internal conversation they're having. So it's interesting.
There are certainly big conversations. I mean, I would say one of those conversations is represented by the fact that, well, these books, and in particular Hadi Mubarak's, is sort of saying that we need to give more attention to the craft of tafsir than we have done. We shouldn't just dismiss that, because
yes, that's the point she was making in the
there are people who operate within the tafsir paradigm, and she's particularly pointed to Ibn Ashur, who are able and show how you can come up with, in a way, novel interpretations and solutions that are yet
within the framework of,
in that framework,
legitimate tafsir exercise. Yeah.
So a lot of debate also surrounds this book. This book was quite a strong intervention, Aisha Hidayatullah's book on feminist edges of the Quran. And I've read some chapters of it, but basically the argument and what caused the controversy is she, despite coming from a feminist perspective, is saying, the attempt to read the Quran as fully egalitarian and, and therefore all about equality between men and women has sometimes gone too far. Sometimes the authors before her have gone too far in assuming that that's the case, and therefore sort of reading onto the text,
imposing that view onto
pushing some views onto the text. So she's a bit more, let's say, pessimistic about the Quran, fulfilling that need that some people have, experienced to find that egalitarian spirit. So I think that we all probably would believe in some level of, on some level at least, that the Quran is advocating equality. It's just that in what forms, in what circumstances, in what manifestations, that's where interpretations differ. But I personally think that this field, in a way, is happening within Western academia more than it's happening within, as a Muslim conversation amongst Muslims. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it's just my observation. And I think that is a shame. I can understand how it's happened, because I think just the fact that women's voices get marginalized, so then they have had to find a space where they can actually make the argument.
This is an observation about what's happening in Western academic studies, but I have observations about this subject as per what I see in the Muslim world, whatever little I have traveled. So the reality of it is there's a conservative, normative Islam that's spread across the, a huge chunk of our population that says we already had this figured out. There's no reason to revisit these issues. We're fine the way we are. I don't know why you need to bring this discussion on our shores and our homes.
Islam gave equality 1400 years ago.
Islam already took care of all of this. We already solved this problem. This is not our problem. This is somebody else's problem. Great.
Or it's not a problem at all.
It's not a problem at all.
Everything is fine.
Yeah. So there's the everything is fine narrative. At the same time, you have young men and women, and actually even working professional men and women in Muslim countries in massive numbers that are completely disenfranchised from what they know about Islam on the issue of gender. They're thinking it in their own circles. They're saying it. If you provide them the freedom to speak their mind, then they're saying it also. I've experienced this firsthand on multiple accounts. And they need a room for that conversation that is not allowed to take place. So what that does, if there's a need to discuss something, figure something out, talk it out, explore it even academically, at an ilmi level and at a level that everybody can participate in, then you get enough people that are just being suppressed so much. The analogy I give is if you press down on a spring and you keep pressing, then eventually something will give and it will explode. So there's an element within the Muslim population now in different countries that's exploded, and they're like, you know what? Away with Islam, away with this patriarchal nonsense, and there's like far left feminism or death, kind of like, almost a militancy. Yeah. And we look at them as we look at those women that are protesting and speaking out and all of it, and we look at them as the problem. They're not the problem. They are actually the result of an unaddressed pain point, as far as I'm concerned. Like there's an issue, there's a discussion, there's a narrative that needed addressing. There were questions that needed to be answered, and the answers that were being provided We say that they represent Islam. I say that we chose the convenient copy-paste answers and not realizing that those answers aren't enough and that requires more investigation.
And those answers that were comfortable to those who are comfortable being comfortable.
Yeah.
Which for the most part, I'm saying men. So we don't have to revisit anything because it doesn't affect men.
You'd be surprised. It's also a good number of women that are in a traditional setting and they're comfortable with tradition the way it is. Now the question is, when we say we need to revisit some issues, you could think of this as, this is a liberal agenda. This is rethinking Islam. There's reevaluating, what the Quran and Sunnah say, etc., etc. The problem with that account is that a lot of what we consider traditional values, if you do an investigation of our own history, our own fiqh tradition, our own tafsir tradition, it's not as cut and dry, black and white as we're presenting it post-colonialism. There is, in fact, an intellectual decline, and some positions are being dishonestly presented as the only position or the most convincing position, when in matter of fact, it's not the most convincing position. So this has happened on a number of occasions with me, and in order for me to grapple with this problem, instead of coming up with a conclusion, what I decided to do was, in private, sit with traditional ulama, sit with experts and muhaddithin and say, hey, this issue, what I'm studying is leading me to conclusion X. Can you help me understand where I'm going wrong here? Help me figure this out. And to my shock, more often than not, very conservative, very traditional ulama are in agreement with what I'm saying, but only in private settings. And the reason for that is not because they're dishonest. The reason for that is we have a mafia mentality in certain fragments of the Muslim community. And if even scholars speak their mind on something based on their years of exhaustive study, not because they've become some puppet of a liberal agenda, because they've studied something, but they're going to say something that goes against the mob's emotional comfort zone.
Unfortunately, there's more than one mob. So
yeah, there's multiple
mobs. If you say anything, you're a simp or you're ISIS.
Right.
This is life on Twitter.
Right.
So if you say anything, the people on the other side are gonna just throw everything at you.
So here we are. We've been discussing our tradition. We've been discussing our scholarship. Now we're looking at also Western scholarship, and there's other things we have to discuss. But we have to really make a conscious decision to hold on to la nakhafu fillahi lawmata la'im, right? Here's what we're finding. Here's what we're going to discuss. We're open to being corrected, but we're not open to being intimidated into silence, not by Western criticism because it doesn't match their sensibilities, and not by some social norms that have been established in the Muslim community that don't want to hear what actual investigation into the Quran, into Islam is saying, because we don't want to hear that. That's not what I heard when I was growing up. Sorry. I'm actually not sorry. We've got to discuss it,
So speaking of discussing, we need to have platforms and avenues through which serious research can be published. So we have got. Do you like the transition? It was okay. I will give it 5 out of 10. So examples can be journals within the Muslim world, or of course there are Western journals as well. So I've just got a few examples of that genre of works here. So this is this one I think is from Egypt but published in London, if I remember correctly, called المجلة الدولية للدراسات القرآنية. It's not a very famous one, but there are actually bigger ones that come out of Saudi. But this has some quite prominent authors. If you have scanned through the names, you might recognize.
Yeah.
And this was one that we picked up when we went to Malaysia. The University of Malaya have this journal called Quranica. They don't know, but they stole that name from me because my organization Quranica
used to be called, yes. That's how I was introduced to you.
مجلة عالمية لبحوث القرآن. So this is a quite old edition that I happen to have with me. But it's just examples of research around the Quran that gets published, and it can be in all sorts of topics. It can be about historical topics, or indeed can be on things that pertain to the here and now and the future, using the Quran as the basis for our explorations. This was conference that I attended in Istanbul, they have a whole series on Ottoman
Tafsirs.
This particular one is about Ottoman tafsir, and then they have got Ottoman hadith studies, Ottoman kalam studies, Ottoman
Interesting.
Also different ones. So this one all about tafsir. Most of it is in Turkish. There were a few in Arabic and then a few in English. So I have a paper in here which I presented there about, it's called the Digital Mufassir. So it's about the tafsir of Al-Alusi. That was so that I can get into the Ottoman conference. I was like, I'll make it about Alusi, but I'll also make it about something future facing. So I didn't want to look at it purely historically. So what I discussed in there is it's reimagining the tafsir of Al-Alusi for a new era. So I said, imagine that we managed to bring Al-Alusi to our modern day using a time machine, or we went back to his time with the tools that we have. Have us flick through if you want. And he wanted to compose his tafsir. How could we use digital tools to support the production of that tafsir? So the reason for asking that question is to say, well, if we wanted something as good as or even greater than Alusi in the future, how can digital approaches to authorship be brought to bear, instead of just doing the same old book approach, which was the limit of what they were able to use at their time. So sometimes slightly zany ideas. These are a few issues I have of the Journal of Quranic Studies.
I have a few myself, yeah.
Which comes out of SOAS and is printed in Edinburgh. So these are the ones typically that I've got a paper in. Yeah, so...
Sohaib Saeed, the Shaheen Affair and the Evolution of Usul Tafsir.
Yeah, we talked about that one.
Yeah.
About Abdul Sabur Shaheen and the evolutionary reading of the Quran. So that was in 2019. And then this year I had this one called Fights and Flights, 2 Underrated Alternatives to Dominant Readings in Tafsir. So yeah, Journal of Quranic Studies, the chief editor is Professor Abdul Halim, so it's got a special place in my heart. But generally we as academics try to publish in multiple journals and reach multiple audiences. So that's journals. Now, you ready for another smooth transition?
I'm so ready.
So having talked about some of the Western writings, we have here also Gabriel Said Reynolds has got a couple of books which are very significant and important for us to consider, the Quran and its biblical subtext.
Yeah.
And this one, the Quran and the Bible, which is kind of it's a translation of the Quran by Ali Quli al-Qara'i. His name is Ali Quli al-Qara'i, who is a Shi'i translator of the Quran. But the footnotes here, or the notes that he's added, Gabriel Reynolds has added, are essentially what Western academics have identified in terms of intertexts or connecting passages
from the Bible,
potentially sources from the Bible or elsewhere, according to their perspective, I mean.
Yeah.
So then, of course, for Muslims, it's very straightforward and simple to think that it's not a source, but merely, something in common, because Allah revealed the Quran and He revealed the books before, from which these things appear. But of course, this ties closely with a genre which I'm sort of pulling up here, which is called Isra'iliyyat. Roughly speaking, Judaica or Judeo-Christian materials. And in the early periods especially, and even later, Mufassirun would include such things in their commentaries. So where you have stories of the prophets, for example, and the Quran can often be very brief and leave out a lot of the detail for very high wisdom reasons. Mm-hmm. Yet somehow when you are writing a commentary, it feels unsatisfactory to just sort of say, and we don't know this and we don't know that. They'd rather say, well, we have some information that we heard that this prophet actually, this person was called that, and this was their name, and this is where they lived. And so they add extra details. And the source of that, typically
usually
isn't from the
biblical
Prophet
material.
ﷺ himself, which would make it hadith and authoritative, but it comes from, those who were around who knew about the previous scriptures, converts from the people of the book, or even maybe sometimes not converts even.
Yep.
But discussions and things that would circulate. So that kind of material, later on you find, Azhari scholars, and even before them, people like Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, Al-Alusi in his tafsir, who are very negative about Isra'iliyyat, especially when they become very extensive and elaborate and beside the point of what the Quran is focusing on. But if you go to the early period, you find they were fairly easy with this. Like, they didn't necessarily say these texts and narrations are the authority to interpret the Quran, but they just saw it as reading it alongside, does no harm.
I think Western academics, at least, they didn't realize they were doing this for me, but they did. They got me thinking about Isra'iliyyat a certain way. So the old way was, we shouldn't rely on them because we can't trust what the Bible is telling us, and we shouldn't use that to fill the gaps in the story of the being told by the Quran. Well and good. The Western academics come along, and the first thing they notice is the Bible is clearly being contradicted by the Quran in the same story. The Quran's telling the story of Noah and Abraham and Jesus and whoever else in very different ways. So there's common ground, and there's also these divergences, right? So the first wave in Western academics that I got familiarized with was that the Quran simply got it wrong. There's the Bible account. There wasn't very good plagiarism. So it's plagiarized from the Bible, but not a very good job. Later waves in Western academics comes along and says, actually, this doesn't look like plagiarism at all. This looks like a retelling. So they call it the Quranic retelling. What that means to them is that the Bible has a story, and the Quran seems to put a new spin on that story. I look at it from a confessional, Iman point of view. And what I look at it as is, so the Quran is taking an existing story that was not only found in the Bible among the Christian and Jewish communities, but had somehow also spread in the Arabian region. There is interaction between Jews, Christians, and other faith communities. Surah Al-Kahf was an interesting example of that. It's not a biblical story. It's a post-biblical story of saints that was popular among a certain section of Christians. So what the Quran is doing is, it is taking something that people are vaguely familiar with, and then, not in great detail to contradict everything that they've heard before, but actually tell the most important parts of the story that, number one, highlights what has been corrupted from what's become popular, right? So then, so it's clearly diverging, which means the details about names and lineage and location and all of that stuff is fine. But now, that's what really happened. So the Quran isn't focused on all of it. It's focused on the part that needs attention. That needs attention. And it's recalibrating it and bringing it back to a purposeful story. So it's no longer just history or interesting facts or interesting legends or stories. Now it's purposeful. So studying the biblical account is actually really beneficial in, not that oversimplistically coming back to the Muslim attitude, we don't take tafsir from these sources because we can't trust them. Actually, I think we should look at it from a different lens. The Quran is offering us, by doing this biblical subtext study, an insight into how did the mind of the Jewish and the Christian, average Jew and Christian, and the rabbi and the priest, how are they processing these stories? And when the Quran came along, how did they see that the Quran is hitting at some really key pain points that the most knowledgeable among them know about, right? So it's doing something really remarkable here. Now, one of the places that I thought was the most fascinating, because Musa is such a huge topic in the Quran, and Moses is, a huge chunk of the Old Testament. He's a central figure, really, of the Old Testament. We have a story of him that they don't have. We have the Musa and Khadir story, and it's nowhere to be found. I thought it was profoundly interesting that this occurs in Surah Al-Kahf, where if we are to trace our narrations and our tafasir about what's in the backdrop of Surah Al-Kahf, there's an attempt to prove the Prophet as not very knowledgeable. So ask him riddle questions, right? And Allah, remarkably, tells a story that the supposedly knowledgeable of their own prophet aren't knowledgeable of regarding their own prophet, right? Because there's no subtext for the Musa story. And Orientalists are like, is this Gilgamesh? Is this taken from this legend or that legend? I look at it as Quran's doing something completely different here. It's saying, yep, I'll tell you something you didn't even know about your own prophet. A journey he took that clearly he didn't see fit to tell you about. You know?
So it seems that approaching these things, whether you want to term this the study of Isra'iliyyat or you want to think of it as subtext of the Quran, is a very rich field. There's also
absolutely
a need for greater precision in the approaches, and I think you've done your own muraja'ah, that is to say you've revised your own stance on that over time as you've seen more. There are scholars also in the Arab world, like this group of scholars led by Dr. Saeed al-Tayyar in Markaz Tafsir published this one, Muraja'at fil Isra'iliyyat, and here they're making the argument to an Arab scholarly audience that we need to sort of wind back some of the negativity towards Isra'iliyyat and recognize a role that they can play. So I think that there's a further conversation to be had, especially with things that we've gleaned from our experiences and our readings in Western academia.
Maybe we should discuss when the time comes with Markaz Tafsir and this group what we did with Surah Yusuf, because that was a really interesting exercise of the biblical subtext and how the Quran diverges. And from what I came to know later, even non-Muslim academics and actually even Christian missionaries and people in the confessional space, in the Christian space and the Jewish space were actually interested in what we were doing with Surah Yusuf and Joseph in the Bible. Yeah,
so there's a richness to engaging with those texts, but not just simply throwing things on top of
That's
each other.
Right.
So let's conclude this with a work that I know that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
This is the English version of it. It's called The Onomastic Miracle in the Quran. It's a strange word. I don't think many people know onomastic, but it's to do with proper names in the Quran, especially names of the prophets and so on. And its Arabic title, so the same author summarized it in English. That's what's happened here. But it's called Min I'jaz al-Quran fi A'jami al-Quran. So he makes a very surprising kind of argument.
Yeah, he does.
And quite bold claims, actually, which I know some people find almost disqualifying right at the beginning, that he sees that all languages descend from Arabic.
Yeah.
This cannot really stand. But regardless of that, what he does on a micro level is he looks at individual names of, for example, Ibrahim. Alayhi salam. And he says, well, here's how Hebrew scholars have tended to analyze that name, and this is what they think it means. But in the Quran, we have a pointer towards another kind of meaning. So he makes an argument based on his knowledge of Semitics.
It's interesting. He adds something else. So he says, he makes the claim sometimes that biblical scholars got it wrong. So he'll say about Abraham, it's not a Hebrew name because he wasn't a Hebrew. He's in ancient Babylonia, so it's a Babylonian name. So we have to look at the Babylonian language to try and do the etymology of his name. He'll say about Musa, instead of looking at Mushe, which is something along the lines of something in the water, Ma and Shay, Hebrew closeness to Mu and Shay, which fits the story, right? But he says no, they wouldn't have named him in Hebrew because he was raised in the Pharaoh's castle as a prince. So he must have been named in the language of the master, not because he wasn't raised as a slave. So the name given to him must not have been in the slave language, right? So he says, well, maybe if we want to explore Musa, we should look at ancient Egyptian to figure out what Musa means. So he traces, I think, 5 or 6 languages that he says that foreign names in the Quran, non-Arab names in the Quran can be traced back to. The second part of his argument is that the Quran is situating these names in contexts
which explain the meaning
the meaning of the name. So what he's saying, for example, with Ismail is actually, does trace it to Hebrew, this one, and he says it's Yashma'il or Yishma'il, which is actually, Il is their word for God, like Allah, and then Yashma is like Yasma'u, to listen. And Yasma'ullah is Allah listens. So Ismail is actually God listens. And the story is when the baby was born, Abraham is overjoyed and he says God listens, and that becomes his name. Right? So,
but that's, I think, within the Jewish understanding as well.
Yes.
But with Ibrahim, for example, he says, well, it actually means Imamun Nas.
Yeah, Avraham. Yeah, I remember what he said.
So then he says, then in the first mention
Leader
of Ibrahim,
of many. Leader of many is what he breaks it up as.
Yeah, but then he gives that in Arabic as Imamun Nas, because it's like in the ayah itself, the first mention of Ibrahim. Inni ja'iluka linnasi imama.
Yeah.
So there's a pointer within the text towards the meaning.
So that's what he was doing with Ismail when he says, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. You listen.
Right.
So he's made these kinds of correlations with about 60 names in the Quran.
So I think it's a very ambitious project, and one which, again, like when we said about the one by Bassam As-Sa'i, where it's quite a radical proposition, it throws new ideas onto the table, which deserve to be reckoned with, and then you might find that
not everything holds up.
But even if 50% of what he says is solid and sound, it would still be an amazing thing.
So one really cool one that comes to mind is David, which is Dawood to us, right? And David is actually, Vid is might, and David is the one of might, and the Quran uses Dhul Aid. Dhul Aid, which kind of translates Dawood in that way. So he's got some interesting ones. I asked Sharif on our team to evaluate some of his work, and he has criticisms of some of it, he approves of some of it, so it was interesting to see.
I put together a kind of a work group to go through it bit by bit.
I have summarized notes on it if you want them. So alhamdulillah. So this was our look at biblical studies. There's a section you wanted to do about ikhtilafat.
Yeah, so that's next, inshallah.
That's next, okay, inshallah. So we'll talk about that next. Jazakumullahu khairan, everyone. Hope you guys are enjoying it. We certainly are. Goodbye. Now get out.
How would you like to explore the heart of the Quran, Surah Yasin, guided by an important mufassir of the 20th century, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur? We've put on a special course at the Ibn Ashur Center, going through Surah Yasin with a new translation and a new commentary based on the important insights of this great exegete. Head on over to ibnashur.com/academy to find out more. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.